Tonight, we're covering the 5 most terrifying aspects of night operations in Vietnam that turned darkness into a weapon against American forces. These aren't stories pulled from Hollywood. These are the raw, unfiltered realities requested by Vietnam veterans themselves who want the truth told. This is about the psychological warfare that happened when the sun went down, when every sound became a potential threat, and when American technological superiority meant absolutely nothing. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version you learned in history class. This is about young men, average age 19, sent into a jungle that came alive at night. If you think you understand Vietnam because you've seen a documentary, you're about to learn what those filtered narratives left out. This is about the terror that veterans still wake up from decades later. The veterans who survived these night operations have been clear. People need to understand what darkness meant in Vietnam. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a fundamental shift in who controlled the battlefield. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army owned the night, and American soldiers knew it. This content contains descriptions of combat, psychological trauma, and the brutal realities of jungle warfare. If you served in Vietnam, and these topics are difficult, please take care of yourself first. For everyone else, you're about to understand why night operations in Vietnam created some of the most psychologically scarred veterans in American military history. Let's get into it. The Vietnam War fundamentally changed how the United States military understood night combat. Unlike conventional wars, where both sides typically avoided large-scale night operations, Vietnam became a conflict where the enemy deliberately chose darkness as their primary operating environment. From 1965 to 1973, American forces conducted thousands of night operations, ambush patrols, listening posts, Firebase defense, and reaction force missions that placed soldiers in an environment where their training, technology, and tactics were systematically undermined. This topic remains under-discussed because the psychological impact was so severe that many veterans simply couldn't talk about it. Declassified military psychiatric reports from the 1970s and 1980s show that soldiers who primarily operated at night had PTSD rates 40% higher than those who conducted daytime operations. The Department of Defense didn't want to acknowledge that sending teenagers into the jungle at night, often in small teams of 4 to 6 men, created trauma that would last lifetimes. According to military studies conducted after the war, night operations accounted for only 35% of all combat missions, but represented 52% of American casualties in terms of killed and wounded. The reason is simple. At night, every advantage the United States possessed, air superiority, artillery support, superior firepower, became compromised or completely unusable. Each of the 5 fears we're covering tonight is interconnected. They compound on each other. The fear of friendly fire made soldiers hesitant to call for support, which increased vulnerability to ambush, which heightened paranoia, which led to sleep deprivation, which impaired judgment. It was a psychological spiral that started the moment the sun went down and didn't end until, or if, soldiers made it home. The most bitter irony of Vietnam night operations was this: American soldiers were often more afraid of their own support systems than the enemy. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. At night, calling in fire support became a calculated gamble that could end with your entire patrol being killed by American ordnance. The mathematics were brutal. In darkness, without visual confirmation, artillery forward observers had to rely on compass readings, estimated distances, and radio coordinates to direct 105 mm or 155 mm howitzer fire. A single degree error in direction which is only 17 meters of deflection per 1,000 meters of range, could place high explosive shells directly on friendly positions. According to military records, approximately 15 to 20% of all American artillery casualties in Vietnam were from friendly fire, and that percentage increased to nearly 35% during night operations. Fire support bases would launch illumination rounds first, massive flares suspended by parachute that created 2 million candle power of light for 60 seconds. But those 60 seconds also silhouetted American positions, making them visible to enemy gunners, while temporarily destroying the night vision soldiers had spent 30 minutes developing. One infantry lieutenant described in a documented interview, "You'd hear incoming, and for those first 2 seconds, you didn't know if it was theirs or ours. That moment of not knowing, it's what I still dream about." Night helicopter insertions and extractions represented another dimension of friendly fire risk that was worse than anyone expected. Huey pilots, flying without visible ground references, using only instruments and dim cockpit lighting, had to navigate to landing zones marked by strobe lights or infrared signals. The rotor wash from helicopters, producing winds of 60-80 mph, could blow away marking panels, extinguish signal fires, or even topple trees onto waiting troops. But the real terror was the gunship support. AC-47. Spooky gunships carried 3 7.62-millimeter miniguns capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. From 3,000 feet altitude, these aircraft would circle friendly positions and saturate enemy areas with fire. The problem? At night, with ground troops, often within 100-150 meters of enemy positions, the margin for error was measured in seconds of trigger time. Veterans described watching red tracer streams. Every 5th round was a tracer, arc down from the sky, not knowing if the pilot had accurate position data. One forward observer stated in an oral history, "We marked our position with infrared strobes that only the pilot could see through night vision. But if that strobe failed, if the battery died, we were just coordinates on a map." The mental toll of requesting fire support at night created a unique form of combat stress that compounded with each mission. Radio operators and team leaders carried the crushing responsibility of knowing that every fire mission they called in could potentially kill their own men. The standard procedure was to provide an 8-digit grid coordinate, direction to target, distance, and description. But at night, terrain looked different, sounds echoed deceptively, and even experienced navigators could be off by 100 meters or more. Veterans consistently describe the voice stress during night fire missions. Radio chatter that was calm during daylight became tense, rapid, with frequent requests for confirmation. Repeat became a forbidden word. It could be misinterpreted as repeat fire mission. So soldiers had to say again, adding another layer of protocol to remember under extreme stress. The sensory overload was intense. You'd be whispering into a handset, trying to give coordinates while listening for movement, watching your sectors, and processing the screaming of wounded men. Sleep deprivation amplified every error. After 3 to 4 days in the field, with perhaps 2 to 3 hours of broken sleep per night, soldiers were operating in a cognitive fog. One squad leader described in a published testimony, "I called in a fire mission on night 5 of an operation. I transposed 2 numbers in the grid coordinate. Thank God the FDC caught it. I would have dropped 105 millimeters rounds on another platoon." The escalation to the most extreme version of friendly fire fear came with B-52 arc light strikes and tactical airstrikes at night. B-52s flying at 30,000 feet would carpet bomb target areas with strings of 500-pound and 750-pound bombs, creating devastation across kilometers of jungle. The planes were invisible and inaudible until the bombs hit, creating a rolling wave of explosions that could be felt from 10 kilometers away. Documented incidents include at least 7 confirmed cases where American ground units were hit by arc light strikes due to coordinate errors or outdated position reports. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers on night patrol knew that somewhere above them, invisible aircraft were carrying ordnance that could vaporize their entire unit, and the only thing preventing that was accurate paperwork and radio communication. One veteran described the sound as the earth being torn open. You'd hear it coming like thunder, and you'd just pray someone knew exactly where you were. The second fear was equally insidious, but operated on a completely different level: the absolute terror of being isolated and abandoned in the darkness. Perhaps no fear was more psychologically devastating than the knowledge that if things went wrong at night, you might not make it out. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. At night, medical evacuation became a complex operation that could mean the difference between survival and death, but the risks often made it impossible. The concept of the golden hour, getting wounded soldiers to surgical care within 60 minutes, was a daylight luxury. At night, medevac helicopters required secure landing zones with adequate lighting, often necessitating that ground troops set up strobes or flares while simultaneously defending against enemy fire and treating casualties. According to military records, night medevac response times averaged 89 minutes, compared to 35 minutes during daylight. That 54-minute difference translated to a 23% higher mortality rate for seriously wounded soldiers injured at night. The landing zones had to be large enough for a Huey, requiring a circular area of at least 80 feet diameter, and clear of obstacles like trees, which meant most night contact happened in terrain unsuitable for immediate extraction. The numbers were stark. In 1968, during the peak of American involvement, there were 2,847 night medevac requests, where helicopters either couldn't reach the wounded or were turned back due to ground fire, weather, or inadequate landing zone preparation. One medic described in a documented interview, "You'd have a guy bleeding out, sucking chest wound, and you'd hear the pilot say, 'Unable to land, too hot.' You'd just hold that soldier and know he wasn't going home." Night ambush patrols and listening posts operated with a terrifying understanding. If they made contact, reinforcement before dawn was unlikely. These teams, typically 4 to 6 men, positioned 500 to 1,000 meters from the main perimeter, were the early warning system for Firebase attacks. But their isolation was absolute. Moving through jungle in darkness to reinforce them risked more casualties, friendly fire incidents, and potentially walking into a larger ambush. Military doctrine emphasized that listening posts were expendable assets, whose job was to detect enemy movement and provide warning, even at the cost of their own lives. Veterans who served on these missions described the psychological weight of knowing they were sacrificial. Radio communication was limited to whispers and brief transmissions using code words. One infantry private stated in an oral history, "You'd sit there in a 3-man position, 600 meters from the perimeter, and you'd hear movement. You couldn't light them up because you'd give away your position. You just waited and hoped they'd walk past you." The amplification factor that made abandonment fear worse was how frequently critical equipment failed at night in Vietnam's environment. PRC-25 radios, the standard infantry communication system, had an effective range of 5 kilometers in jungle terrain, but atmospheric conditions at night, combined with the dense canopy, could reduce that to less than 2 kilometers. Batteries corroded in the humidity, antennas broke during movement, and handsets filled with condensation. Veterans consistently described the visceral terror of a radio going dead during a night mission. Without communication, you couldn't call for artillery support, medevac, or reinforcement. You became invisible to your own command structure. The standard procedure was to carry spare batteries, but batteries added weight. Each PRC-25 battery weighed 1.2 pounds, and soldiers were already carrying 70-90 pounds of equipment, ammunition, and water. The sensory reality of communication failure was profound. You'd key the handset and hear nothing, or you'd hear broken fragments of transmission through static, unable to confirm if your position reports were received. One radio operator described in a published testimony, "My radio died on night patrol about 2,000 meters from our Firebase. We tried everything: new battery, cleaning contacts, adjusting the squelch. Nothing. We were just 5 guys alone in the dark for 7 hours until sunrise." The ultimate fear related to abandonment was being in a position that was being overrun with no possibility of extraction until dawn, if you survived until dawn. Multiple documented incidents involve small firebase or outpost positions taking human wave attacks at night, calling desperately for reinforcement or extraction, and being told unable or first light. Firebase Kate in 1969 was hit by an estimated 600 North Vietnamese Army troops at a road 245 hours. The 140 American defenders called for emergency extraction of wounded, but helicopters couldn't land in the kill zone. By dawn, 39 Americans were dead and 71 wounded, many of whom bled out during the night waiting for medevac that couldn't reach them. Survivors described the sound of wounded men calling for help in the darkness, knowing that medical evacuation was hours away. The psychological damage was multi-layered: survivor guilt for the men who died waiting, rage at command for not attempting extraction, and the internalized lesson that when darkness fell, you were fundamentally alone. One platoon sergeant described it as learning that all the talk about no man left behind had an asterisk, not until sunrise. The third fear operated on a completely different level. It was about enemies you couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't predict. Night operations in Vietnam introduced soldiers to a level of paranoia that bordered on psychosis. Every step could be your last, and you'd never see what killed you. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. The Viet Cong's most effective weapon wasn't the AK-47 or the RPG. It was the ability to turn the environment itself into a weapon, and at night, detection became nearly impossible. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo stakes, often coated with human waste to cause infection, were invisible in darkness. They were placed in covered pits, along trails, in shallow water, and around likely landing zones. A soldier's weight would trigger a false floor of leaves and branches, plunging a leg onto stakes that could penetrate 8-10 inches into flesh. According to military records, booby traps and mines caused approximately 11% of American deaths and 17% of wounds in Vietnam. But during night operations, those percentages increased dramatically. One study of night patrol casualties from 1967-1968 showed that 34% of all wounds sustained at night came from booby traps rather than direct fire. The mathematics of moving at night made this inevitable: reduced visibility, slower movement, inability to properly clear routes, and exhaustion-impaired attention. Veterans described the constant mental calculation. Every step required visual scanning, weight distribution testing, and listening for the click of a tripwire or the crunch of a pressure plate. One infantry sergeant described in a documented interview, "At night, you'd move maybe 10 meters in an hour. Each step was terror. You'd test the ground with your foot before committing weight, and even then, you couldn't see what you were stepping on. The amplification of booby-trap danger at night came from more sophisticated systems that required visual detection to avoid. Tripwires, often made of nearly invisible fishing line or wire, were strung across trails at ankle height, connected to grenades, artillery shells, or homemade explosives. During daylight, an experienced point man could often spot the faint glint of wire or disturbed vegetation. At night, those visual cues disappeared entirely. Command-detonated claymore mines represented an even worse threat. The Viet Cong would observe American patrol routes, place captured or homemade directional mines along the routes, and wait. An observer hidden 50-100 meters away would watch for the patrol's heat signature or listen for their movement, then detonate the mine at optimal moment. The blast would send 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc at 4,000 feet per second, shredding everything within 50 meters. The equipment designed to counter this, mine detectors and tripwire probes, were nearly useless at night. Mine detectors required slow, methodical sweeping in a grid pattern, which was impossible during tactical movement. Tripwire probes, simple rods used to feel for wires, required stopping every few steps. One combat engineer stated in an oral history, "You could maybe clear a night defensive perimeter with detectors, but on patrol, no chance. You just accepted that every step was Russian roulette." The mental toll of perpetual threat awareness created a unique form of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Psychologists who studied Vietnam veterans identified what they termed sustained anticipatory anxiety, the brain's threat detection systems locked in permanent overdrive. At night, this became all-consuming. Every sound, a branch breaking, leaves rustling, water dripping, could be an enemy soldier or a booby trap being disturbed. Veterans consistently described the sensory overload of night. Movement. Your pupils would be fully dilated, straining to gather any available light. Your hearing would become hypersensitive. You'd hear your own heartbeat, the rustle of your uniform, the breathing of the man in front of you, all while trying to detect threats. The smell of the jungle at night, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and sometimes the unmistakable scent of human waste used to treat pungi steaks, became associated with imminent danger. Sleep deprivation compounded the paranoia. After multiple nights of broken sleep, soldiers began experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. Shadows moved, sounds that didn't exist seemed real, and the ability to distinguish between actual threats and exhaustion-induced perception failures collapsed. One rifleman described, in a published testimony, "By night 4 or 5 of an operation, I was seeing things that weren't there. I'd swear I saw someone moving, and it'd be nothing. But you couldn't ignore it because the one time it wasn't nothing, you were dead." The escalation to the most extreme version of invisible threats came with booby traps, designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. White phosphorus grenades, attached to tripwires, would explode in a flash of 5,000-degree burning particles that couldn't be extinguished with water. They had to burn through flesh until the fuel was consumed. The screams of soldiers hit with white phosphorus were described as inhuman by those who heard them. Documented incidents include pits containing sharpened stakes covered in human excrement, snake pits with venomous bamboo vipers, and even deliberate placement of rabid animals along patrol routes. The goal wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. One veteran described finding a dead American soldier who'd triggered a pit trap. The stakes had gone through both legs and his groin. He'd bled out slowly, probably over hours. That was the point. They wanted us to find him like that. The fourth fear was perhaps the most primal. Being underground in darkness, while the enemy controlled every advantage. Tunnel operations at night, or rather, operations that were essentially perpetual night, represented a descent into a special kind of hell that combined every fear humans instinctively carry. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. The Viet Cong's tunnel systems, particularly the massive Siu Chai complex northwest of Saigon, represented over 250 kilometers of underground passages, some with 3 levels reaching depths of 10 meters below ground. These weren't simple foxholes. They were complete underground cities with living quarters, hospitals, weapons caches, and command centers. American soldiers designated as tunnel rats would enter these systems with nothing but a flashlight, a .45 pistol, and sometimes a knife. According to military records, tunnel operations had a casualty rate of approximately 33% for those who regularly performed tunnel clearing duties. The dimensions were deliberately small, often only 80 centimeters wide and 70 centimeters high, forcing soldiers to crawl or crouch. The largest tunnels might reach 120 centimeters in height, but these were rare. Most movement was on hands and knees, through passages that seemed designed to trigger every claustrophobic instinct. The numbers told a grim story. Tunnel rats typically weighed less than 140 pounds and stood under 5 feet 7 inches. Larger soldiers simply couldn't navigate the passages. The average tunnel rat served 4 to 6 months before being rotated out due to psychological stress, though many requested transfers much earlier. One tunnel rat described in a documented interview, "You'd crawl into that hole, knowing statistics said you had a 1 in 3 chance of not coming back the same way. The walls pressed in, you could barely breathe, and somewhere ahead, in the darkness, Charlie was waiting." The amplification of danger in tunnels came from how the Viet Cong had rigged their systems with traps specifically designed for the confined space. Punji stakes angled downward would impale a crawling soldier's hands or face. Trap doors would drop into deeper pits. Most terrifying were the flooding traps, chambers that, when triggered, would fill the tunnel with water from concealed reservoirs, drowning soldiers who couldn't turn around or back up quickly enough. Documented booby traps in tunnels included scorpion boxes, containers that, when disturbed, would release live scorpions onto a soldier's body in complete darkness. Bamboo vipers were placed in ceiling spaces where soldiers would brush against them. Tripwires connected to grenades or explosives were strung at neck height in passages barely tall enough to crawl through. The confined space meant blast overpressure from even a small explosive could rupture eardrums and cause internal injuries. The structural integrity was deliberately compromised in some sections. The Viet Cong would create false support beams or weakened ceiling sections that would collapse when disturbed, burying soldiers alive. One combat engineer stated in an oral history, "We found sections where they dug chambers above the main tunnel, filled them with dirt, and rigged them to collapse. You'd be crawling along, trigger the trap, and tons of earth would come down. If you were lucky, it killed you instantly." The mental toll of tunnel operations created psychological damage that psychiatrists later identified as distinct from other combat trauma. In the tunnels, multiple senses became useless or actively harmful. Vision was limited to the narrow beam of a flashlight, which also gave away your position. Hearing was dominated by your own breathing, heartbeat, and the scrape of equipment against tunnel walls, all while trying to detect enemy movement ahead. Veterans consistently described the smell of the tunnels as one of the most persistent memories. Human waste, rotting food, gunpowder residue, and the distinctive odor of Vietnamese tobacco mixed with cordite. The air quality deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels dropped, carbon dioxide accumulated, and in deeper sections, soldiers would light cigarette lighters to check for adequate oxygen. If the flame went out, you knew you had minutes before potentially losing consciousness. The tactile experience was equally disturbing. The tunnel walls were often slick with moisture, humidity approached 100%, and the temperature could reach 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers would emerge from hours underground soaked in sweat, covered in mud, and often infested with lice or other parasites. One tunnel rat described in a published testimony, "You'd feel things crawling on you in the dark. Rats, insects, spiders. You couldn't stop to deal with it because stopping meant staying longer. You just kept moving and tried not to think about what was on your skin." The escalation to the most extreme version of tunnel fear came during close-quarters combat in the tunnels. Unlike surface combat, where distance provided some psychological buffer, tunnel fighting meant literally encountering enemy soldiers at arm's length in near total darkness. Firefights in tunnels were brief, brutal, and often determined by who shot first. The acoustic trauma of gunfire in confined spaces was severe. A .45 pistol discharge in a tunnel would generate 160-170 decibels, causing immediate hearing damage and disorientation. Multiple shots would leave soldiers temporarily deaf and disoriented. Some tunnel rats began using suppressed weapons or knives specifically to avoid the acoustic damage, but that meant closing to even shorter distances. Documented incidents include at least 14 cases of tunnel rats encountering enemy soldiers face-to-face and engaging in knife fights or hand-to-hand combat in passages too narrow to properly maneuver. One veteran described finding a tunnel rat's body entangled with a Viet Cong soldier. Both had stabbed each other to death in the darkness, too confined to use firearms. The psychological impact of that type of primal combat, in absolute darkness, was something that traditional military training had never prepared soldiers for. The fifth and final fear brought everything together into a comprehensive dread that defined night operations in Vietnam. The culminating horror of night operations in Vietnam was the systematic destruction of any concept of sanctuary or safe space. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. The ultimate psychological blow was learning that even fortified positions with barbed wire, claymore mines, bunkers, and artillery support could be overrun at night. Firebase attacks typically began with mortar and rocket fire, 82mm mortars, and 120mm rockets launched from positions 2 to 4 kilometers away, impacting without warning. The first explosion would be your alarm, and you'd have seconds to reach fighting positions while high explosive rounds walked across the firebase. According to military records, between Hai Nguyen's 1967 and 1971, there were over 400 ground attacks on American fire bases and base camps, with 85% occurring at night. The casualty statistics were devastating. Attacks on Fire Support Base Marianne in 1971 killed 33 Americans and wounded 83 more. Firebase ripcord in 1970 became completely untenable after sustained attacks, requiring evacuation under fire, with 61 killed and over 300 wounded in the battle. The numbers revealed the tactical reality. Even with defensive preparations, claymore mines, protective wire, and pre-registered artillery defensive fires, a determined night attack by 200-300 NVA soldiers could penetrate perimeter defenses within 15 to 20 minutes. One artillery officer described in a documented interview, "We had overlapping fields of fire, crew-served weapons positioned to cover dead space, illumination rounds on standby. They still got inside the wire at Firebase Ripcord. When they're willing to take 50% casualties just to reach your position, numbers beat preparation." The amplification of danger at night came from weapons that gave no warning and no defense. The 122 Medevac rocket, launched from simple tube launchers that could be set up in minutes and abandoned, delivered a 42-pound high-explosive warhead with devastating effect. The rocket made a distinctive whistling sound in flight. Veterans describe it as a freight train or tearing silk. But by the time you heard it, you had perhaps 2 seconds before impact. These rockets had a range of 11 kilometers and were wildly inaccurate, which made them even more terrifying. You couldn't predict where they'd land. One might hit the ammunition dump, creating a secondary catastrophe. Another might land in the motor pool. A third might hit a barracks, killing 12 men in their sleep. During the Tet Offensive, American positions received an estimated 50,000 rocket and mortar rounds over a 2-week period. The equipment designed to counter this, counter-battery radar, could detect the rockets in flight and calculate launch positions, but that didn't stop the immediate attack. You'd still hear "incoming" screamed across the firebase, still scramble for bunkers, still wonder if this was the rocket with your name on it. One infantry lieutenant stated in an oral history, "You'd be sleeping, dead exhausted, and that first explosion would hit. Your body would react before your mind. You'd be running for the bunker without fully waking up." Some guys never made it because they were too disoriented. The psychological dimension that made nowhere safe even more terrifying was the sapper threat. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sappers would approach perimeters at night, crawling for hours through wire obstacles, disarming claymore mines, and cutting paths through defenses. These elite soldiers, often wearing only shorts and covered in mud or grease to avoid detection, would infiltrate right into American positions. Veterans consistently described the visceral horror of sapper attacks. The sappers carried satchel charges, canvas bags filled with explosives, and their mission was to get inside bunkers, command posts, or ammunition storage areas before detonating. Multiple documented attacks include sappers who successfully entered fighting positions and killed Americans with knives or satchel charges before being detected. The sensory reality was nightmare fuel. You might hear nothing until the explosion, or you might hear a faint sound and turn to find an enemy soldier 2 feet away in the darkness. One attack on Bien Hoa Air Base in 1968 saw sappers penetrate 3 separate defensive lines, destroy or damage 47 aircraft, and kill 25 Americans while fighting inside the perimeter for 6 hours. The psychological message was clear. Your defenses don't matter. Your technology doesn't matter. We can reach you anywhere. One sergeant described in a published testimony, "After sappers hit your fire base, you couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow, you'd think they were back. We'd have guys firing at nothing, seeing movement that wasn't there, because they knew sappers could be inside the wire without triggering an alarm. The culmination of all these fears, friendly fire, abandonment, invisible threats, claustrophobic tunnels, and no safe spaces, was that soldiers stopped sleeping. Not by choice, but because the accumulated psychological stress made genuine rest impossible. Medical records show that by their third or fourth month in country, soldiers averaged 3.4 hours of fragmented sleep per 24-hour period, often less during extended operations. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. Sleep-deprived soldiers had impaired judgment, slower reaction times, increased risk of accidents, and significantly higher rates of psychiatric casualties. Studies showed that soldiers operating on less than 4 hours of sleep for multiple consecutive days experienced cognitive impairment equivalent to being legally intoxicated. One platoon medic described finding a soldier who'd fallen asleep standing up during a night ambush patrol. He was so exhausted his brain just shut down. He would have died if we hadn't been there to wake him. The data from military psychiatric studies conducted in the 1970s showed that chronic sleep deprivation during Vietnam service correlated with PTSD severity decades later. Veterans who'd primarily operated at night, who'd gone weeks with minimal sleep, reported significantly higher rates of nightmares, hypervigilance, and sleep disorders 30 to 40 years after the war ended. What connects all 5 of these fears, friendly fire, abandonment, invisible threats, tunnel operations, and the absence of sanctuary, is the complete inversion of normal warfare. In conventional conflicts, night provided cover and rest. In Vietnam, night became when Americans were most vulnerable and the enemy was strongest. This wasn't an adaptation of existing tactics. It was a fundamental restructuring of how combat functioned. Unlike conventional warfare, where technological superiority and firepower typically determined outcomes, night operations in Vietnam stripped away those advantages. A B-52 bomber, the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal, was useless against an enemy you couldn't locate in the darkness. Artillery that could level a grid square was dangerous to call in when you couldn't see where it would land. Helicopter support that defined American mobility became a liability when landing zones were invisible. The psychological mechanism that made these fears so damaging was their interconnection. Each fear amplified the others. Fear of friendly fire made soldiers hesitant to request fire support, which increased vulnerability to ground attack. Fear of abandonment created reluctance to conduct aggressive patrols, which gave the enemy more freedom of movement. Fear of booby traps slowed movement to a crawl, which extended exposure time. The claustrophobia of tunnels made soldiers avoid underground pursuit, which left enemy sanctuaries intact. The knowledge that nowhere was safe eliminated the psychological recovery that comes from having a rest area. Decades of studies on Vietnam veterans have documented the long-term impact. A 1988 study by the Department of Veterans Affairs found that veterans who primarily operated at night had PTSD rates of 41% compared to 29% for day operation veterans. A 2007 follow-up study showed that even 35 years after the war, night operation veterans reported significantly higher rates of sleep disorders, hypervigilance, and startle responses. They were more likely to require ambient noise to sleep, more likely to sleep with weapons nearby, and more likely to experience combat-related nightmares. The medical term for what happened is sustained traumatic stress response. The human nervous system isn't designed to maintain threat vigilance for months or years. When it's forced to do so, the threat detection systems become permanently altered. Decades later, a car backfiring at night can trigger a full combat response. A shadow moving in peripheral vision can cause instant panic. The brain's threat assessment calibration was permanently reset by those nights in Vietnam. The military psychiatric research emphasizes that night operations created what's termed environmental betrayal trauma. Darkness, which humans instinctively associate with rest and safety, became associated with maximum danger. Sleep, which is a biological necessity, became a vulnerability that could get you killed. The fundamental trust in your own support systems, artillery, air support, medevac, was undermined by the reality that those systems could kill you as easily as save you. What makes the Vietnam night operation experience particularly tragic is the age of the soldiers. The average age of an American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. In World War II, it was 26. These were teenagers, many on their first time away from home, being sent into an environment that would have challenged experienced combat veterans. They were given perhaps 8 weeks of training, most of it focused on daylight operations, and then placed in situations that destroyed fundamental psychological security. These weren't just soldiers experiencing combat stress. They were young men, barely out of high school, watching friends die in the darkness from weapons they couldn't see, being hit by their own side's artillery, dying alone because helicopters couldn't reach them, or going mad from sleep deprivation and constant terror. Over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Millions more came home carrying trauma that would shape the rest of their lives. The night operations in Vietnam should be studied not just as military history, but as a case study in how psychological warfare through environmental control can be as effective as firepower. The Viet Cong and NVA understood something fundamental. If you can deny the enemy rest, safety, and the psychological comfort of their own support systems, you don't need to win battles. You just need to break them mentally, and time will do the rest. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, particularly if you operated at night, I want you to know that what you experienced was real, the fear was justified, and the scars you carry are the result of an environment that humans weren't designed to endure. The studies validate what you knew. Night operations in Vietnam created some of the most severe combat trauma in American military history. If you have memories or experiences you're willing to share, please share them in the comments. These stories need to be preserved. For everyone else, I ask that you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. This is the kind of historical content that goes beyond sanitized versions. It's about understanding what was actually asked of these soldiers. Real history is raw, uncomfortable, and necessary. Remember what was asked of these soldiers. Thank you for watching.